Thanks for coming to this talk. I know there's a lot of other options. I personally would love to be watching the talk about VR, so it's good to have you here. So yeah, what I'm going to talk about today is React Native. Probably read the abstracts. You're familiar more or less with what it will be. So in my personal opinion, I think React Native is a better way to do mobile. It's not perfect in a lot of ways, but it does a pretty damn good job. And so I'm going to talk about some of the common questions that people have about React Native and common concerns, and hopefully illuminate what I consider to be the strengths and weaknesses and help you to make the decision of whether this is an appropriate technology for your business. So really quick introduction. Seems slightly off-center. So React Native is a library for making world-class mobile applications on iOS and Android, and potentially other platforms very soon. So you do this using primarily JavaScript and CSS and a HTML-like syntax using something called JSX. So I think one of the engineers at Facebook, Andy Street, put it pretty well. He says that React Native brings what developers are used to from React on the web. So that's declarative, self-contained UI components and fast development cycles to the mobile platform while retaining the speed, fidelity, and feel of native applications. So here are a few examples of some React Native apps. So the one on the left is the Facebook Groups app. You can go download that on your phone right now if you want and play with it. That was one of the first ones. In the middle, we see Discord. Discord's a chat application. Primarily intended for video games, but actually it's been sort of co-opted by the React community as our choice for our common chat room, because we were, in a sense, kicked off of Slack because the community was too large and they didn't want to support a large open source community. On the right side, that's something called Townski. It's a Australian startup. It's kind of like Instagram and Foursquare come together. It's really pretty app. I recommend checking it out. And so that's 100% React Native. In the middle, that's mostly React Native with some actual native components written and bridged to React Native. And on the left side, the video that seems to have frozen is Discovery VR. So that's a virtual reality sort of application from the Discovery Channel. And so that feels like a pretty good app. I recommend checking these out. But yeah, this is sort of like what React Native is capable of. So I think it's important to ask about the tools that you use. Like what jobs does this tool make easy, and what jobs does it make hard? So I think you'd all agree that any programming language that is complete or Turing complete is capable of solving every programming problem given sufficient memory and time, right? And so what differentiates one language or tool from another, I think, is what tasks they make easy and what tasks they make hard. So which parts of building an app with React Native are easy and which parts are difficult? So yeah, let's discuss some of that. So I've kind of broken this down into a few sections. And the first one we're going to talk about is performance and look and feel. So this is a really common question. I think a lot of people have been bit using WebViews in the past. I mean, they're certainly a lot better than they were years ago. But a lot of people coming into and like looking at React Native will say, oh, but this uses JavaScript and CSS. Is it not going to feel like these other Cordova apps where it just doesn't feel quite right? And like, what makes React Native different from that? Why should I pay attention to it? So the one that stands out most is probably that React uses the UI components that are native to the platform that it runs on. And I'll demonstrate what that means. So if we look at the video on the left, there is the native components that you would have in the browser. So these are just the DOM components, right? You have like paragraphs, you have links, you have forms that have buttons and text inputs, radio buttons, all that sort of thing. In the middle, those are the components that are built into React Native, and those are built on top of the native view components that exist on iOS, right? So we see like a scroll view, we see the segmented control, these sorts of things that like don't exist in the DOM, but those are the primitives of that platform. And so these are made available to you with with React Native. And on the right side, it's the same idea, but with Android. So yeah, what React Native does is it actually takes care of translating your XML-looking components and all of your state related to those components from your JavaScript definition across a bridge over to the native component itself. So you're actually dealing with these native components. So what Cordova apps and mobile websites try to do quite often is make components that look like the native ones. So going back here, right, we see on the left, that's like what you get to like out of the box in the browser. So in order to make it look like when you're using a mobile app that's written entirely with the DOM, in order to make it look like it's a native app, often what will happen is people will recreate the native components and style the divs and buttons and whatnot to look like the native ones. So here's an example of, I think, a pretty well-built WebView app for a car share program in Vancouver, which is where I'm from. It's, you know, it like works pretty well, but you can definitely tell like where the rough edges are, and more so when you use it than when you look at a video of it. Probably a lot of you have had an experience of, you know, using something and then you try and maybe like swipe something over how you would normally and it just doesn't do anything, or it has a weird scroll effect, or like the first thing that happened in the text input on the left side, I pressed the focus on the text input and it just jumped like halfway down the page and had the cursor somewhere. Like just sort of weird things that give you the sense that it's kind of off. And I think users can tell when this happens a lot of the time. So if you look at the reviews for this, a lot of them are saying like, why didn't you, like this app kind of like has a weird feel to it, or like this doesn't even work. It's hard to get it working necessarily on a bunch of platforms. There are some good tools that ease the pain on that significantly, like Ionic, which there will be a talk about later today. You should definitely check that out. Another way that users can tell is that the file size is significantly different. I don't think you can read that, but the file size for this simple app is 48 megabytes, which is like half the size of the Facebook app, which is pretty much like an operating system. And all this is like a few pages with some websites in it. And the reason why it's so big is because in order for it to work decently on older versions of Android, you have to actually package like a full build of Chrome using something called Crosswalk inside of your app. So all of these apps are shipping like a browser inside of it to make it work decently. And that has a huge impact on it. Like, can you imagine in a developing country where data is expensive and you have to download a 40 megabyte app to, I don't know, check if your parking spot is available or something like that, right? And yeah, like I said, I think users notice. So I don't think anyone would be surprised if it looked like this for this app, right? Add the browser Chrome there and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Whereas if you put this browser Chrome around something like the Twitter mobile app or the Facebook mobile app, you'd be like, oh wow, this looks really good. This doesn't look right. Like, that's amazing that you're able to do this in the browser. I think that's a clear sign of that. But it turns out that actually, although sometimes it does matter, sometimes it just really doesn't matter if it feels a bit off. Like, if your content is really compelling and you don't have some competitor that has this same content with better marketing and better user experience, then you can get away with it, I think. And so this, I'm not sure how to say the name, Swirkit or something like that. They are very popular and they get a lot of shining reviews on the Play Store and the App Store. And it, like, honestly, using it like feels a little bit janky in a lot of places. Like, here it is sort of glitching as I'm trying to go somewhere. And like, people just don't really care that much because they're just like, I want to work out and I want to see what exercises to do. So it really depends on the use case. But I think the overall concept that this really comes back to is something called the Uncanny Valley. So this is a very common thing to mention when talking about web apps and native apps. And what it is it came from the field of robotics. And so the Uncanny Valley is the hypothesis that, in the field of aesthetics, which holds that when features look and move almost but not exactly like natural beings, beings, it causes a response of revulsion among many observers, or some observers rather. Maybe revulsion is like kind of a strong word for this context. It's like, as we'll see, like if we have something like this, which is like, oh, that's like kind of like a human, but only in the way it sort of behaves and whatnot. It has a head and a body and arms, but it doesn't, like, you're like, oh, that's cute, that's fine. This one, it's like getting a bit closer to being human, but it's like still like oh, that's kind of cute, that's good. And then you get like this weird rendering of Obama where you're like, ooh, that's creepy. Like, I don't like that one. This is where I feel like a lot of these apps fall into. They don't necessarily have to, but you're kind of pulled towards that when you're working with WebViews, I think. And then there's our beautiful Prime Minister of Canada. You know, you could stare at him all day. So now here's a completely unscientific chart, which is based off of my gut feelings for how this is with native and WebView apps. And so it's different in that along the x-axis, what we have is native UI likeness rather than human likeness. This might be different for everybody depending on how they feel about apps and what kind of polish they expect of a certain app. This is just my personal curve, so I guess yours might be different. So what we see at the very bottom there, like where the freaky Obama was, we have jQuery mobile, right? Which I don't think anyone here would say is good. Like good for them, that was a long time ago, and like it was a good innovation in the space. But when you use it, it was just like, this is weird. Looks like when it's still, maybe it's supposed to be like a decent reproduction of it, but then it just does not feel like an app in any way. And so that, I would say, generated in a lot of people a feeling of revulsion towards using WebViews for these types of things. I think that a lot of WebView apps will still sort of fall in the Uncanny Valley, sort of a little, like significantly ahead of jQuery mobile. And then I think when you do a really well done WebView and hybrid app, you can get like similar to like one of the like maybe low effort React Native apps, in my opinion. So another example of like how, like this is kind of a jQuery mobile sort of thing where I was looking for something to do when I got here on Saturday, so I thought, oh, I'll check nearby photos on Instagram, and this site came up on Google, and like, oh, I'll click on this thing. Oh no, that's not working. Like weird fading in things. I clicked there, like everything's like jumping around. It looks like a mobile app, but it's in the browser, and then you're like, I don't know, I don't like this. And it didn't work either, so yeah. So that's one thing, right? It uses the platform UI components. There are some significant advantages to that. But then on top of that, React Native takes advantage of threading in a way that WebViews can't. And so the way it works is that, like a very high level, JavaScript runs in the JavaScript core VM on its own high priority thread. It doesn't block the UI thread, so if you're doing something in JavaScript that takes 200 milliseconds to process and then at the same time you scroll in your scroll view, you'll be able to scroll just fine. Maybe if that requires a callback to JavaScript to get some content to fill in this new part of the screen, then you might have to wait for that to be filled in until the JavaScript thread is unblocked and is able to process that scroll event and re-render and update. But yeah, a quick example of what that looks like is if we go in the browser and at the bottom I'm just doing a loop where for 10 seconds I'm repeatedly checking whether 10 seconds have elapsed or not. And as soon as it elapses, I yield control of the JavaScript thread. I terminate execution. And so what happens is I start running it and I'm trying to scroll. It doesn't let me scroll. I go to hover on things. There's no hovering being picked up. And this is because JavaScript blocks the main thread in the browser. And this is the same thing that would happen if you use the WebView in your mobile app. If you have JavaScript blocking, your whole app is just going to freeze. And there are other things that also block the main thread that are a significant issue, I think, for mobile apps. And you saw that with the Sworkit example when there was a bit of lag when I switched to the exercises screen, and it was decoding a bunch of images. So images are also decoded on the main thread in in the browser. And so the result of that is that when you're decoding these large images, you can't do anything. And you've seen that, I'm sure, as you're scrolling through a page and it, like your scroll maybe gets interrupted or it just feels like you're dropping frames. That's essentially what's happening there. So it's a little bit different on with React Native. So here I'm pressing a button in the top right. You can't really see it so well, but I'm running that same code, but just for a few seconds. And during that time, I'm able to scroll up and down just fine. Doesn't have any impact on that. But it also doesn't actually process the event that needs to go back to JavaScript to say, OK, render this new view. So it does take advantage of threading in a way that allows your app to remain responsive. But of course, if you're tied to the responsive JavaScript, you're still going to have the same sort of effect. Similarly, in React Native, we decode images on some separate threads. So it uses Fresco on Android, for example, which has a pool of image decoding threads. And that's all taken care of in a way that it won't block scrolling or anything like that. And it should be, I think, mentioned at this point that people have tried using the current technology that's available on the web to do things like decode images in a web worker, but it is incredibly slow. I know Facebook experimented with that. JavaScript doesn't have the capability for that right now, but that's certainly something that could come in the future. And so that would be a really nice benefit for web views. So this threaded communication, I think a lot of people, when they think of threads, they're like, oh no, now I'm running JavaScript, which is bad enough already, and now I've got to think of threading in a language that isn't built with that in mind, right? So it's actually not that bad, because what you end up with is in the browser you might have something like we find the DOM node and then we just grab the offset width if we want to find the width of something. We do that all synchronously, works great. In React Native, we would actually make a call to measure on this same node, and measure would then be put into the message queue that would then get sent over this bridge to the native side and would execute on the layout thread or queue. And once that is completed, which would be on the next frame, then the measurements would be sent back to the JavaScript thread. And so you need to use a callback or a promise or something like that. And so the way that it's done here is I'm using a callback and then just destructuring the return value. React Native also ships with async await enabled. So if any of you use C#, you're probably familiar with this, or if you use Hack. So it's pretty simple. If you can make it look synchronous just like in the first example by just using await to get the result back from there. So that's pretty much in your day-to-day work with React Native. You don't have to think about threading beyond something like this, where you need to introduce a bit of asynchrony into cases where you otherwise wouldn't in the browser. So another concern that people have is that WebView performance is good enough or it's getting better. And that's totally true. For a lot of cases, WebView performance is definitely good enough, and it is definitely getting a lot better. And there are new concepts as I mentioned with the web worker, there's mentions of compositing thread and various other things that could be coming along in the pipeline. And it's also worth mentioning that the web views on iOS, for example, they run JavaScript core, but with the JIT enabled. And that's not possible using JavaScript core with React Native because of some restrictions that iOS has. So you can actually get better JavaScript performance out of a web view in theory. So that's a pretty good advantage from that point of view. I don't know exactly what that would come out to, but yeah, that's certainly nice. But on the other hand, React Native doesn't have to use JavaScript core. It can use any JavaScript engine. So if it turns out that Chakra gets far ahead of JavaScript core in terms of performance, then React Native could just swap out JavaScript core for Chakra. And sure, it would have to ship that engine, which would be an extra few megabytes to whatever, if it's Android, the APK or IPA on iOS. But that's not it's not a terrible cost necessarily compared to the 20 megabytes for a crosswalk. But yeah, if the performance from WebViews is good enough and it lets you ship your app and satisfy your customers, by all means do that, right? That's pretty much what we're all trying to do here, right? But one thing you might want to consider is if it's good enough right now, will it be good enough in a month? Like, what happens if you run into a wall at some point where you're like, oh, I need to do this feature, but I just can't do it because this limitation of web views. Like, have you handcuffed yourself? Have you gotten yourself into like a pretty bad corner there? That's possible. This is a quote from Viju, or Christopher Chateau, who's one of the creators of React Native. He says that a fundamental problem with the web as it exists now is that a user cannot go one level deeper when you want to or have to in order to provide a good experience. So in the little faded out bit there, that's less important, but there's a big list of things like customizing image decoding or caching, which you just don't have control over, right? You have this JavaScript layer, and the rest of it is just this native code that ships with Chrome, or ships with Firefox or whatever, and you have no control over that. So then, in order to solve these problems, you have to convince the browser vendors that you have a solution that is good, and then you have to wait for that to be incorporated into the browser engines, and then ship a couple years later. So it can take quite a long time. So an important principle of React Native is that developers should always have access to an escape hatch. So there are some parts where you're writing JavaScript in React Native and you're like, I just can't right now, using the abstractions that exist today, make this functionality that I think is important for my app. So what you can do in that case is you can drop down to native code, and you can write it just like you would inside of a native app. You can just write that section of the app natively, and it's not going to feel awkward or anything. It works really well. It's well integrated into React Native. So an example of that, when I showed the Discord app earlier, their chat view portion of the app, the one with the scrolling messages, that was all implemented using Component Kit, which is a iOS, I think it's Objective-C++ tool that's modeled around React, but it allows you to write the code natively and then just bridge it to React Native, so you're able to render that component from JavaScript and pass the data in and whatnot, and ultimately have this underlying native code that is as fast as you could be on the platform. So an example of how this looks like, is just a really quick, stupid, pointless example, but all it is just to show you, like, if you want to create a new view component. So in this one, let's say that we didn't have a map view built into React Native. What you could do is create this map manager, which returns an instance of MK map view. And then we could export properties that would just be set on it, like shows user location. And then on the JavaScript side, we would require this native component, which knows where to look for this thing. It's just RCT map would look for a RCT map manager and then instantiate that and insert that into the view hierarchy. So the way that would actually work inside of your React component then is we would just render a map view like that, and we could pass in shows user location equals true. So there's not a lot to learn about that. If that's something that if you already know some native, then that should be pretty straightforward. Yeah, I probably should have walked through like that. So pretty similar if we want to bridge some functionality that isn't actually a view. So this one, I just want to log some message, for example. So here we just indicate we want to export this module. Then we define a method which takes a callback, and we're just going to create an array just so we have something to pass back and just put some data in it and then call it back. And what happens from the JavaScript side then is that we call native modules, my module, get data, and then we log it out. Oh, this one's state name. Yeah, that's the first one there. Okay, yeah, this is another common concern is like, okay, so it feels faster than web views, and like, but is it like really going to be faster or as fast as native? I mean, of course, a compiled language like Objective-C is always going to be faster than JavaScript, right? But I think there's more to it than that, right? So if you look at when the UI frameworks were developed for iPhones and Android, those were like the first 4 years, I believe. So it was from 2007, I think, was the first release of the iPhone. And that was a single core device until the 4S in 2011. So the years leading up to the initial iPhone release and the first 4 years up to the 4S, the whole framework was built around the idea of like, oh, like threading, whatever. Like, let's just do everything in the main thread. And so UIKit is very much oriented around that. And so the natural tendency that you have when you're using it is not necessarily to do the right thing. And there are a lot of, like any experienced developer on the platform is going to find ways to work around that, whether that's using like Component Kit or Async Display Kit, which are two really solid iOS libraries that take more advantage of multiple cores on our devices. But ultimately, these frameworks were built with that in mind. So on the contrary, if you look at React Native, it's built really embracing our multi-core device world right now. Just out of the box, you have the main thread, which handles touch interactions, handles all sorts of important things related to actually drawing the views. And then you have the shadow thread, which handles performing layout. So that's measuring, given this Flexbox CSS properties, what's the top, left, width, and height of every view on the screen. You have these image decoding threads, and you have to do nothing as a developer to take advantage of this out of the box. It's just use React Native and you get this. And then of course you have the JavaScript thread for running a lot of your application logic. And there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of headroom here for improving it. So yeah, another thing on that is you kind of have Facebook on your side here, which is a pretty good person or team rather to have on your side when they have some of the biggest apps in the world. If you look at Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook app itself, Messenger, I mean, like everyone has those apps, and these are huge. And they have a lot of expertise in making high-quality mobile apps and optimizing them. And so if you look at this example where Facebook was working on integrating React Native into the events section of the main Facebook app, they spent a couple of months just optimizing the React Native framework. And at this point, it was already a lot of people were using it and enjoying it. And then just these updates kept shipping in order to make it meet the, not drop their metrics when they integrated it into the main app. And what you end up with is that there are these improvements at the framework level that sped up the app by 2 times. And you just get that for free as a user of the framework. So that's pretty cool, as you kind of have your own infrastructure team kind of working for you there. Another example of that is that like APIs are designed in a way so that they can be optimized transparently. So what you saw before, right, there are a lot of things in the design decisions there that led to this being possible. Now what we're looking at here is something called the animated API. So this is a really nice declarative API for doing animations in React Native. And it's also for React Web, although it's not quite fully released, I think, for that yet. It's still sort of in beta. But what's happening here is that the API was designed to be declarative so that you could just, it's very similar to the concept of React where you say, this value is tied to, let's say, the Y position, X position of this component. And then you perform an animation, like a spring, on that value, and then it just updates the views that are attached to it. And so what we did here was we worked with a former Facebook employee, Christoph Majera, and we did something that was always in the plan for this API, which was to take the actual computations and applications of the animated values and move that from the JavaScript thread to its own thread, or ultimately we ended up landing on keeping it on the actual main thread. And there are a lot of benefits to that because now you can block the JavaScript thread for 200 milliseconds in the middle of an animation, and it doesn't matter. It will still keep animating, and it'll look great. And it's common to block the JavaScript thread for 100 milliseconds or something like that when you're rendering a new screen. So this is a really great optimization that, again, it's not entirely in master yet, but it's pretty close. There are parts of it that you can use today, and you just get it for free. So there are a lot of little benefits like this that you get when you're using React Native. So, all right, performance. React Native makes performance easy where it can, and it also makes it easy to drop down to the native level where you can't achieve the smoothness and responsiveness that you want just by using JavaScript. It also takes advantage of the high-quality native platform components, so your apps just look and feel like native apps, and no extra like jumping through hoops to make it sort of look in the same way. And as I mentioned, the cost of this approach is that you have to write JavaScript that ends up being more asynchronous in a few places. So if you need to do things like get the layout or interact with the native module, then you have to do that asynchronously. But there are a lot of upsides to that. So yeah, that's just the trade-off you have to keep in mind. OK, the next point, don't worry, they're not all as long as that first section, is integration and extensibility. So people will often ask, like, all right, so I can use these components that are built into the platform, but can I use any like third-party libraries that already exist? And so yeah, you can. Like as I mentioned with this one, they used Component Kit for list view, and the rest of the app is React Native, and then you just have this chat feed, which is currently one of the weaker points I think in React Native, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Yeah, you can just integrate that pretty easily, right? So it's just the same thing I showed before with the map view, but instead you sub in whatever you're doing there and make sure you, where you're exporting the view properties, you might have something like a list of messages that are passed in, or maybe you call some method on it to pass in new list of messages. Yeah. Another one, can I use things like accelerometer, vibration, geolocation, camera? Yeah, you can. It's very similar to how it's done with Cordova, where you have this bridge where you send messages across, and yeah, I'm sure you're all at least somewhat familiar with that at this point. And yeah, that's just like what we demonstrated before with views. So here I am using the camera, and this is actually just integrated into the app. That's actually difficult to do with web views because you can't mix and match. I think you can to some extent. I'm not sure to the degree which that's possible right now. Mike from Ionic can probably tell you more about that. But this is just integrated very, very nicely into the app, and it's quite simple to do, really. So here's an example of just implementing like vibration. If you want to make your, I mean, this is implemented for free in React Native, so you can use it anyways. But if you wanted to implement this for whatever reason, for fun, this is all that it takes to implement vibration. And then, as you can see at the bottom, you just call like rct vibration.vibrate, and that's it. So it's a really simple and performant and well-built bridge. There's been a lot of effort put into tuning it and building an API that is really easy to extend. So yeah. So another common question is like, well, what if Apple or Google releases like these new APIs? I want to take advantage of these right away. I don't want to wait for someone to integrate that. So it's actually really easy. Like this is an example of a React Native app using the peek and pop from the new version of iOS, or I guess new as of a year ago or whatever. I implemented a prototype of this in like an hour, and then these people just took that and made it work for their use cases. Like, it's really simple. Yeah. So a common question then following all this bridging stuff is like, well, all right, how often am I going to have to do this, right? I didn't sign up to write a native app necessarily, like in Objective-C and whatever. I want to write React code or whatever. I want to use JavaScript so I can properly take advantage of sharing skills, et cetera. Well, the answer is like you really don't have to do it that often. Like if you're doing something that's novel that nobody's done with React Native yet, which is quite possible because it's only a year old, then yeah, you'll need to maybe do that for a certain part of it. But there are a lot of libraries that exist out there right now, and you can just pull those in from NPM and include them in your project. There's a lot of like, there's a talk earlier about Realm, which is a really fast mobile database. That company actually, they built their official plugin for React Native as well. There's SQLite plugins. I mean, all sorts of things. The camera library is a plugin you can just drop into your project. So you really won't have to write it very often, honestly. OK, another question. What if I already have an app written in Objective-C or Swift or Java or whatever? Can I still use React Native for like a screen in it or like a certain part of it? And yeah, you totally can, right? I was mentioning before about the Facebook app using React Native on the events dashboard. You can check that out on your phone right now. If you have the Facebook app, just go to the More tab on the bottom and scroll down to Events, and that's all in React Native. And just that screen and like certain other parts of the app are done like that. So yeah, not too difficult. Here's an example of it going here. So that's React Native in the Facebook app. Right. Quick look at how that's implemented. This is some Swift and just changing it up a bit. All you really have to do is instantiate a root view and give it the path to the JavaScript file that has your app inside of it, or subsection of your app or whatever. And so here I'm just defining a view where this view contains the app in it. And then you just insert that view into your app in the same way you would any other view. All right, developer experience. So some people would be like, all right, yeah, fine. But like, why would I do this instead of like, I already know how to write apps. Why would I bother with learning React Native and writing JavaScript and all that kind of thing? So I think there are some significant advantages to using React Native over traditional approaches. So here's an example of using hot module reloading. So you'll notice that in the app on the right side, so here I'm just adding some styles to it, and what it will do is it's going to actually update what you see on the right side, but maintain all of the app state. So I could be 4 or 5 screens deep in some route stack and be like, oh, I really want to change the font size of this or something like that. And then just if I have hot module reloading enabled, I make a change, save it, and I see it reflected in the app within a second or two, which is a huge advantage, I think, compared to the way a lot of people do native mobile development right now. So yeah, let's watch that run for a second because it's really nice. OK, that's indulgent enough. Another one is layout. So I personally really do not like any of the layout systems on iOS or Android. I think that Flexbox and the web have really got it right. Flexbox is awesome. It's super easy to, like, once you learn it, it's super easy to reason about. It's like here I am just making like the individual tweet layout from Twitter, and you can see that like there's a few styles, like pretty simple stuff. I'm using flex direction, row, flex one, justify content, and so actually React Native has a subset of CSS implemented, which is considered, or one of the guy who created it, which I mentioned before, Christopher Trudeau, it's a useful subset of CSS. So maybe we don't need everything. There's no text transform uppercase because you can just call to uppercase in JavaScript. So that's not included right now. But you get a lot of things. You get width, height, margin, padding, border radius, all these sorts of things that you're just used to. Like probably most people who have done native development have at some point in their lives made a website, and they probably know these simple properties. And and on top of that, you get this inspector where if you're in development mode, you just enable the inspector. You can click around and look at, just like in the browser, what's the, see the orange and green boxes that reflect the padding and margin. And it's really great. Another huge benefit is to be able to update your apps over the air. This is something you could do with Cordova. You've been able to do that for a while, but you haven't been able to do it for native apps, at least not in such an easy and comprehensive way. So here's a tool from Microsoft called Code Push, which they built for deploying live updates to Cordova and React Native apps. So an example of how this would work is inside of a component in your app, you would say code push.sync and pass in some options to indicate how you want your, basically how you want the update process to work. So like, do we show an update dialog? At what point do we, what do we do once we've downloaded a new version? Do we wait until they restart the app the next time to load it, or do we just restart the app for them right away? And there are a bunch of options that you can use there. They've really thought a lot about this and made a solid tool. And so once you've set this up, all you need to do is you make some change in your app like this, go over to the console, and then you just run code push and specify, like here, release React, and they're saying the name of the app. And this one is dev. So this will just be pushed to a staging app. So if you have someone on like test flight or something, you don't have to go through that whole process of pushing it to test flight and waiting however many hours Apple wants you to wait today. You can just yeah, push it right through like this. So that's pretty nice. And as soon as they open the app, the next time, they'll see this update. And there are other policies you can use too. You can, if you want people to get the updates right away, you could sync maybe every minute or so, or set up a WebSocket if you really care that much. And so you just see this dialog, update available, you customize what that says, they press install, it restarts the app, or it just says, okay, we'll install it next time you reopen it. Another one is a tool called Exponent, which is a company that I work at. So we have this tool called XDE, which has a very beta look to it right now because it is. So there I just press publish to exp.host on an app that I have open. I wait 15 seconds or so, and now it's published to a URL that anyone who has the Exponent app on their phone can go ahead and open that and use this app. So you'll see a URL there. If you download the Exponent app and go to exp.host/BrentVatne/helloExponent, you can open that in the app right now. That's pretty easy. I'm going to paste it there. Whatever, no time for that. And so this is the kind of thing that it enables. And you'll notice that on the left side I have iOS, or is that, yeah, no, that's Android on the left side. On the right side I have iOS. And it's running this app, same thing on both platforms, using native UI for those platforms. And anyone can access the app by just going to a URL from Exponent. So React Native opens up possibilities for a lot of really cool things like this that just weren't possible with native tools before. Another thing that's nice, it's not playing. There we go. Is that if you don't want to use Xcode or Android Studio, for the most part you don't have to. You can just do React Native run Android or run iOS. And if you have an Android device plugged in, it'll build the app and install it to your Android device. Or if you, I think actually run iOS only builds it to the simulator, so you might have to open Xcode for that still. But it does a lot of, I guess, you can use Vim if you want, you can use Emacs, whatever you like, and that's pretty nice, I think. Because I know a lot of people don't really like Xcode, and it crashes a lot, so you can avoid that. But then people really do like IDEs on the other hand, right? A lot of people will be like, oh, no IDE, no way, not using it. But React Native has some IDEs actually. So here's a really cool one developed by a company called Deco, where they're taking advantage of hot module reloading to actually provide you with a very interactive development experience. So I'd recommend checking out, you can sign up for the beta and check out the screencast that demos this. It's pretty compelling demo of building the UI, the main UI from the Uber app in something like 2 minutes, where you're just using drag and drop things. And, but a nice thing about it compared to a lot of tools that are sort of builder tools is really you're still working with the code. They don't try and abstract away the code so much, but just like a lot of the mechanical things, like, oh, I want to import a new component into this. Well, you just search the Deco registry, import a component, and it's right there. You have completion on all the attributes of that. You can switch with using sliders or whatever the appropriate control is for that type of value and see it updated live right beside you. So that's pretty compelling. Another one was one you saw earlier, Visual Studio Code. They have a React Native plugin. Microsoft is really buying into React Native. So you know, it's pretty cool to see them building stuff like Code Push and Visual Studio Code integration. So you get code completion, and you can do things like launch the packager or debug by sending breakpoints through Visual Studio Code. Another one I don't have a video of here is Nuclide from Facebook. And so that's the IDE that they all use at Facebook for working with React Native. And it has similar integrations, it has auto-completion, all sorts of things. People often ask, how do I debug my apps? So like, you know, in the browser, I'd be using Chrome and maybe setting breakpoints and logging values, whatever. Well, you could do that in React Native too. You can just actually debug in Chrome or specify whatever debugger you want. You can implement your own custom debugger just like Microsoft did with Visual Studio Code. So here I am, I just open up the app, setting a breakpoint, stepping through it, seeing like, okay, the value's set to this now, and now, okay, let's continue past that, and we see the native alert dialog pop up. So you get source maps, so you see it in the original format. You don't have to do any weird translation of that in your head. How do I test my apps? Here we go. So one nice thing about using JavaScript for a lot of your app is that you can use JavaScript testing tools, which are like pretty fast and pretty good these days, I think. And you don't have to compile your entire app before running the test suite every time. So you're just running a pretty small test suite, but it ran in 3 seconds. And so it's something that you can just leave running in the background as you're coding and see updates pretty easily. All right. Integration testing, it's not really a solid integration testing story out of the box with React Native right now. It's pretty much just whatever you would be doing in a native mobile app with a couple of extra lines of code to integrate it with React Native. So here's an example of TaskRabbit. They use React Native for their Tasker app, and just a demo of how they do their testing using, I think it's like Appium, and yeah. So you can definitely do it, just not like solid support out of the box right now. Like, what if I really want to use NPM? Well, you can. Yeah, React Native ships through NPM. Like all the packages are distributed through that. That said, React Native, you can kind of think of it as like a third environment, right? You have Node, you have a web browser, and then React Native, which there are some like standard library or like some classes and whatever functions that are available and some that aren't in others. So for example, if you need to, if you include a library that depends on the DOM, well, you can't use that because there's no DOM in React Native. I mean, you can use D3 still, but you know how that's being split up into smaller packages. So you just can't use the D3 select library, for example. But you can still use a lot of the very useful graphing functions to generate your scales and whatnot and render that using the React Art library. But you can use things like Lodash or Immutable.js or whatever. Like anything that doesn't have dependencies on the Node standard library or the DOM, you should be good to go. You can also include third-party libraries from CocoaPods or Maven, whatever you would use for your native project. That's also totally fine. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people will come up and just be like, yeah, this thing's the best thing ever, a lot of great things about it. But there are, like, it looks great, I think, in those demos. And maybe some people think, oh, that sucks, but I think it looks great. But there are like some catches to like what I mentioned there. So the upgrade path between versions, like Facebook's always running their apps internally on master, and so the versions are just like an open source thing that can sometimes be thought of as like maybe an afterthought, although they do have a couple of people who've been working on that a lot recently. It can be difficult sometimes to go from one major version to another. It might take you like 20 minutes to figure out what you're supposed to do for that, and it's getting better. I mean, there's a command that you can run, React Native upgrade, which will just copy over certain files that have changed since the versions have changed, but you might just have to do a bit of like run git diff and see where you might have customized those files, or make sure you read through the release notes to find where the breaking changes are. One really cool thing that React Native and React do is they, for updates where this is possible, ship with something called code mods. So these are basically, they will parse your source files and build an AST and then find where certain syntax or function calls or whatever have changed, and then update that to the new version of it. So you just run this script, and if you maybe, let's say an example from before is that there's a component called touchable opacity, which used to require that you have a view as the first child of that. Later that was changed so that you don't need a view anymore. So then you run this script, and it will remove any views nested as the first children of a touchable opacity component, move the style up to that touchable opacity component, and you're done. And so it saves you the effort of having to crawl through all these files and change that manually. And you can actually do like, I mean, as you've seen with things like Babel, there's like pretty complex stuff that you can do through this sort of thing. So it pretty much depends on the same sort of infrastructure as that. Yeah, so another one is that there are some unmaintained third-party libraries that you might need to fork or submit patches for, where people maybe built it and then they didn't change to a newer version of React Native. So this ecosystem is still like growing. So you might run into some pains around that. Hot reloading is like, it works awesome, and then sometimes it's like, oh, that didn't work for some reason. But in the worst case, you just refresh your app and go back to that screen, and you're in the same position as before. And another one that's kind of frustrating is I think this is more of a JavaScript problem, is just sometimes it's just hard to find the source of errors in asynchronous code, right? I think everyone has that problem. But hopefully this zones proposal that's coming up should be pretty useful for that. It's something that looks quite promising. So I don't have a lot of time left, so I think I'm just going to skip past that really quickly. Okay, legal and support. How are over-the-air updates not banned by Apple, right? It's not going through the App Store. You're pushing these updates that change the functionality of your app. Like, how's that possible? So there's actually this part from the terms of service for the App Store that indicate that you cannot download or install any executable code unless it runs inside of WebKit or JavaScript core. React Native runs in JavaScript core, so good to go. If React Native switched out to use a different VM, so like Chakra, maybe this wouldn't necessarily apply, but maybe the terms would change if it has some critical mass at that point. Another one is the license agreement. Some people are really critical of Facebook's licensing. They're like, oh, you're going to own my company. But I mean, look at the companies that are using Facebook now, or sorry, using React now. Everyone's using Facebook. So Netflix uses it, Microsoft is using it, Apple's using it. Do you think these companies would be entering into, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, please don't take legal advice from me, but just looking at what exists out there, it seems like you're pretty safe. And it uses this license, so feel free to read that over and pass it by your lawyers and see if they're okay with it, if it's something that you're interested in. Oh yeah, Walmart uses it, Airbnb, Uber, whatever, name a company, I'm sure they use it somewhere. What happens if Facebook drops support for this, like parse? Well, I mean, that's a complicated question. So one thing is, that's definitely not something that's in sight right now. They're investing a lot in React Native. This is a big technology that seems to be quite crucial to their mobile strategy going forward. Maybe Jim can comment on that more, Jim in the back there, who works on the React core team at Facebook. But ultimately, it is entirely open source. And so, sure, when parse was dropped, they open sourced it and anyone could use that. Similarly, React Native is already open source, and by the day, gaining more users in larger companies, that if something goes awry and for whatever reason Facebook decides they're not going to do this, you have this community of now thousands of people that are using it that could then prop it up. But really, if you're a company that requires SLAs for any of the technology that you use, or you need support, you can't go to one hacker way or whatever and be like, hey guys, here's $1,000. Can you fix this bug for me? They'd be like, security, get this person out of here. So that's the benefit, the downside of open source when it's built by a company that's actually building a product with it versus going with a company that's building their tool as an actual product. So you get a lot of the benefits of they are using it in a real application, and they are stress testing it in a way that is beyond what any of your apps will ever face. I'm sorry, but they have billions of users in Facebook across WhatsApp and whatever. So you get that, but you lose maybe this kind of thing, and that could be a deal breaker for a lot of people. So it's something to keep in mind there. Yeah, I'll skip that because there's no time. Okay, so another one, all right, so I'm pretty sold, but my team is mostly web developers. Does that mean today we can just sit down and start building a React Native app? Yeah, you probably could, but honestly, there is a lot to learn still about mobile development. Whether you know JavaScript already and you know React already, it's a different paradigm of development, right? There's a lot that you still have to consider. What it does is just alleviate a lot of those awful cross-platform things that you need to learn, whether that's Android and iOS specific SDKs or whatever. Another one, how much code will I actually be able to share across platform? So am I just going to have to write 2 separate apps and fork code all the time for iOS and Android? So here's an example of this. This is a component called Slider. So has the same API on both platforms where that's possible. Where it's not possible because something exists on one platform but doesn't on another, then it is suffixed with for example, iOS. So you can customize the image that's used for the thumb button on iOS. So there's a property that you can customize for that. So there you go, custom thumb image. It's iOS only. So otherwise, it's the same. And you just use it like this. Doesn't matter if it's iOS or Android. same thing. You can include that in your app like this. Don't worry about it. OK, here's another more complicated example where you have this component that's implemented only on Android. It's only natively implemented on Android. So this is the drawer layout component. What you can do in this case, so here's what it looks like when I'm using it. You might wonder, OK, so it's only implemented on Android. How are you using it on iOS then? So what you can do is create files like drawerlayout.android.js, drawerlayout.ios.js. In your Android one, you just require whatever component that is that exists already on the platform. Easy. It's like 2 lines of code. On iOS, you just re-implement it. And then you can use that. So the result is that you get a very high percentage of shared code, actually. So if this is from the TechRabbit blog for TaskRabbit, they were able to share something around 87% in total of the code between platforms. And there's some other stuff about configuration. So if you take that into account, maybe 75%. But that's including the generated config files for the different platforms. So depending on how you want to define that. Another one, kind of hard to read here, is the Ads Manager app on iOS and Android from Facebook, which was, I think it was the first app that was fully built in React Native at Facebook. I think their code sharing percentage was something like 87%. And it was built by the same team that built the web version. And so that team built the web version, the iOS version, and the Android version. And they built the iOS version and the Android version. I think the iOS was in 5 months and the Android one in 3 months or something like that. And this was while React Native was in active development, so they would have to, I mean, it is still in very active development, probably 15 commits a day on master. But they would have to go back and be like, hey, this thing isn't implemented yet. Let's figure this out with the infrastructure team. And so I think if they were to implement it now, they would be able to do it a lot quicker. OK, well, this is an enterprise thing. So you might be like, oh, we're a Microsoft shop. Should we not use Xamarin, especially now that it's open source? So the problem with Xamarin, in my point of view, is that from the people I've spoken to that use Xamarin seriously is you still end up with people who are platform experts. So it's like, oh yeah, I'm a Xamarin iOS developer, or I'm a Xamarin Android developer, right? Because you still have to learn all of the underlying APIs, unless you're using Xamarin Forms, which is, from what I've heard, quite underbaked and not really ready for large apps. So what this translates to is, here's an example from the Xamarin samples repository so sure, you use C#, you're writing Android views using C#. These grayed out lines here are the lines of code that are shared between iOS and Android. Here's the iOS version of it. See, now we have UI table view. We have UI table view style, dialog view controller. Totally different API from what you were looking at in your Android app. And again, you get these 2 lines of shared code, which is just your model code. And if your app is largely dependent on models, and you love C# and you know the Android and iOS APIs, then knock yourself out. You're gonna have a great time. But I think a lot of people are using JavaScript a lot. So yeah. When should I use? OK, I only have 2 minutes, so this is gonna have to be quick. Sorry I had to cut it short. Please talk to me later, and I'll show you the rest of it. So yeah, let's say a lot of people here are probably web oriented. So when should I use Cordova instead of React Native? I think a really good use case is outlined by Basecamp. They were once called 37 Signals. You might know them as that. So they built their navigation for the app using native components. And then the actual content views, most of them are done using web views. So if you limit the amount of native specific look that you need to have to your app, and you have already a pre-existing app and a lot of expertise with web views and building for the web, you can get it to work pretty well by just integrating using the native navigation components and then just filling in your content views. You can also do this with React Native, though, right? So here we have a React Native app where when I click into one of these screens, the chart that you're seeing there is a web view, but you would never know because it just looks good. It fits in well. But ultimately, I think web views, I think this is a good comparison where you have YouTube on the web is a pretty good indication, I think, of what the web is capable of doing well right now. But if you compare that to the YouTube mobile app on the right, it's kind of like in a different league. And if you're okay with what's on the left there, if that's acceptable for your customers and your business, then like, you should definitely do that. But it's a matter of like what demands you have for that and whatnot. I'm just going to finish with this last slide, even though I have like 20 more. So ultimately, React Native isn't like something that necessarily would last forever. It was started by people who love the web, right? We love the development cycle. Christopher Chaudot, we worked on it. He didn't have native development background on iOS or Android. And surely a bunch of other people on the team did, though. And ultimately, he wants to help push the web forward by building this new thing where you can iterate more quickly using these web technologies like HTML and CSS, but change out like these underlying implementations of things, find better ways to implement sort of the native layer of web and provide primitives that allow you to build a really solid native user experience using web technologies. So like he said here, a bit jokingly, is like if it all goes well, we just RMRF the project and then React Native apps will just work using web things. So yeah, unfortunately I didn't get to unsolved problems, which is really fun, but definitely come find me tonight and I'd be happy to walk through all of those with you if you're curious about this. So thank you.